Through the blinding snow, a trembling German shepherd bursts forward, the heavy footsteps of a man with a stick pounding close behind. A sliver of golden light from a wooden door becomes its only chance to survive. But once that door closes, the real journey begins, leading to a secret buried deep in the winter woods and a confrontation that could change everything. What could drive this dog to keep going, even when the price might be its very life? The wind came in heavy, unbroken gusts, roaring through the bare limbs of the trees until they creaked and groaned like the hull of an old ship at sea. The road that cut through the edge of the small rural town was no more than a dirt path in the summer, but now it lay hidden under a treacherous crust of ice and packed snow. The sky, a flat, lifeless gray, pressed low on the world, blending with the whiteness until horizon and earth became one endless sheet of winter. The cold gnawed at anything it touched. Each breath turned into a cloud of frost, and the air carried the metallic scent of oncoming snow. Somewhere within this frozen stillness came a sharp, uneven rhythm, light, but desperate, frantic enough to shatter the quiet. The sound was a mix of claws scratching at ice snow, scattering under hurried paws, and the ragged panting of lungs pushed to their limit. A small German shepherd pup burst into view from the tree line, his coat a mottled blend of pale gold and soft gray, now darkened and clumped with melted snow. Every strand of fur seemed plastered to his skin, the tips crusted with tiny shards of ice. His ears were half folded back against his skull, either from the force of the wind or from the weight of sheer exhaustion. His breath came in quick, visible bursts, and his wide amber eyes held an unmistakable look, fear raw and undiluted. Behind him, following at a steady but menacing pace, was a man whose presence seemed to make the very cold tighten. Earl Red Haskins was built like a man who had done hard labor his whole life. Broad shoulders straining the seams of a thick leather jacket neck, hunched down to guard against the wind. His hair a dark, rusty hue that had earned him his nickname, stuck out from under the brim of a battered cap. In his right hand, swinging slightly with each stride, he carried a long, rough-hewn stick, more club than cane, its worn surface stained with age and use. Red's boots crunched through the snow, each step heavy, deliberate, and too close behind the pup for comfort. His breathing was slower, more measured than the frantic gasps of the animal ahead. But it was underlined by a low, almost satisfied growl of effort, as though the chase wasn't just about catching the pup, but about making him feel hunted every step of the way. The pup's pad struck a patch of ice beneath the snow and skidded for half a second. He stumbled, claws scraping, and for one terrible heartbeat it seemed he might go down. But instinct, pure, stubborn survival, pushed him forward. His paws found traction again, the slap-scrape of his movement resuming as he darted toward the faint glimmer ahead. That glimmer wasn't the sun. There was none to be found in this sky, but the warm, trembling light of a lamp spilling from a doorway. At the far end of the snow-bound lane stood a small wooden house, its planks dark with age, its roof heavy with snow. The warm gold light leaking through the narrow crack of the open door was the only thing that seemed alive in the frozen gray world. It pulsed faintly with each sway of the door, a thin ribbon of safety in a landscape that offered none. Inside, Harold Miller had been standing in the living room, one hand resting on the frame of the front door he'd just opened to air out the faint smoke from the wood stove. The winter had been a hard one of the hardest in years, and the house, though sturdy, groaned with each blast of wind. Harold was a man who had outlived both his children and his wife. His days now measured in the slow rhythm of tending the stove, mending what needed mending, and watching the seasons through his frost-bitten windows. His hair, once thick and dark, was now white as the snow piled against his porch. His shoulders were stooped, but there was a steadiness in him that had not yet withered. He heard the sound before he saw its source, a thin, erratic clatter of movement over ice carried by the wind. At first he thought it might be a loose piece of metal banging somewhere, but it grew louder, more frantic. Then came the unmistakable sight, a pup, no more than 6 or 7 months old, barreling toward him through the falling snow, eyes locked on the golden light spilling from Harold's doorway. Harold's brow furrowed as his gaze shifted past the pup to the shadow moving behind him. The figure of Red Haskins emerged through the curtain of snow, his face half hidden beneath his cap, but his posture leaving no doubt he was chasing the animal with intent. Harold knew Red by name, as did most in the county. You didn't have to know him well to know trouble followed in his steps. The pup was nearly at the porch now, his legs trembling with each push off the ice sides, heaving as though each breath was borrowed from the next. For an instant his paws slipped again on the iced-over steps, but he managed to scramble up, claws clicking against the wooden boards. He stopped only when he reached the threshold, looking up at Harold with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to plead without sound. The wind howled through the gap in the door, carrying the sharp, cold scent of the outdoors into the warmth of the house. Harold stood there for a heartbeat. The old instinct to keep to himself, warring with the quiet but insistent voice that had guided his better choices all his life. He glanced again at Red, still several yards away, the man's hand tightening around the stick as if preparing for one last lunge. Something in Harold settled then. Without a word, he stepped back and pulled the door wider. The golden light from the room spilled across the porch, washing over the pup's soaked fur. The animal hesitated for only a breath before stepping over the threshold, paws leaving wet prints on the worn wooden floor. Red slowed at the edge of the yard, his eyes narrowing as the door began to close. Harold met his gaze through the narrowing gap, his weathered face unreadable, but his stance solid as stone. Then the latch clicked, and the storm outside was reduced to a muffled roar against the sturdy walls. Inside, the pup stood just inside the entryway, dripping onto the mat, his chest heaving. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like something he had never known. His ears twitched at the crackle of the fire in the wood stove, at the slow ticking of the old clock on the mantel. He looked at Harold once more, as if to confirm this strange turn of fate, then let his legs give way beneath him, curling up on the mat with a trembling sigh. Harold set the gnarled walking stick he kept by the door into its corner, his eyes still on the small, exhausted figure at his feet. He knew without needing to ask that the pup hadn't just run from the cold, he'd run from something worse. And outside, beyond the frosted window, the snow continued to fall, covering every track in a clean white blanket, as if trying to hide the truth of what had just happened. The door shut with a deep, satisfying thud, muting the roar of the wind outside. The sudden quiet seemed almost heavy after the chaos on the porch. Only the occasional groan of the old wooden frame and the faint hiss of snow being blown against the windows reminded them both that the blizzard still raged beyond these walls. Inside the house was small but well-kept, every surface worn by years of use. The wide plank floorboards carried the uneven gloss of age, their edges darkened where boots had tread the most. The living room opened straight from the entryway, merging into a corner kitchen without the division of a wall. And in that kitchen, a black iron wood stove radiated a gentle, steady heat. A dented kettle perched on its flat top, a low simmer, sending lazy curls of steam into the air. Harold closed the latch, his eyes drifting toward the pup, still standing on the mat. The poor creature looked uncertain, half turned toward the warmth of the room, half angled back toward the door, as though instinct told him that safety was fleeting and might vanish without warning. His tail was tucked so tightly that it almost brushed his belly, and the tips of his ears trembled with each gust of wind rattling the windows. "You can come in as far as you like," Harold said quietly, his voice low and steady, the way one might speak to a skittish colt. He stepped to the side, giving the pup a clear path toward the stove, but made no move to guide him physically. Some animals, just like some people, needed to believe it was their decision to trust. The pup took one tentative step forward, claws clicking softly against the floorboards, then stopped. His amber eyes flicked toward Harold, searching for any sudden movement, any sign of danger. Harold simply nodded once, then crossed the room slowly, picking up an old wool blanket from the back of the rocking chair. The blanket was thick, hand-woven decades ago, in a pattern of muted browns and grays. It carried the faint scent of cedar from being stored in the chest by the wall, and Harold draped it over the arm of the couch closest to the stove. He crouched down to spread a folded corner across the floor beside it, making a little nest. There he murmured more to himself than to the dog. Somewhere warm to land. Steam began to whistle from the kettle, a high, thin sound that filled the quiet room. Harold reached for it with a heavy mitt, lifting it from the stove and pouring the hot water into a chipped enamel mug. He wasn't making tea, not yet, but the warmth in his hands was grounding. He set the mug on the kitchen counter and turned back to the pup. The little shepherd had inched closer while Harold's back was turned. Now he stood just outside the circle of heat radiating from the stove, the fur on his flanks still clumped and dripping in places. Each exhale emerged as a puff of visible breath, proof of the cold still trapped in his body. The firelight painted his wet coat in shades of copper and gold. But up close, Harold could see the truth beneath the sheen patches. Where the fur was thinner places, where the hair had grown in unevenly around old wounds. It wasn't just the fur. There were scars, fine white lines barely visible against the pale gold of his coat. Along his left shoulder, one scar ran in a crooked path as if something sharp had grazed him. But what caught Harold's eye most was the faint raw mark that circled the base of the pup's neck, a rope burn by the look of it, healed but still angry in color. He felt a slow tightening in his chest, an anger tempered by sorrow. Someone had kept this animal bound maybe for most of his short life, and whatever had driven him into the storm tonight had not been his first taste of hardship. Harold lowered himself into a crouch again, making his frame as small as a man of his age could manage. "You've had a rough go of it, haven't you, boy?" His voice was gentle, as though speaking too loudly might undo the fragile thread of trust hanging between them. The pup didn't come closer immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight, one paw lifting briefly, before settling again, a subtle dance of uncertainty. But then, as though drawn by something more powerful than fear, he stepped into the glow of the stove's heat and stopped beside the blanket Harold had laid out. He didn't lie down right away. He stood there, letting the warmth seep into his bones, steam beginning to rise faintly from his wet fur. Harold took that moment to fetch another small blanket from the chair, a lighter one more worn, and brought it over, setting it near the pup, but not draping it over him. "Yours, if you want it," he said. He'd learned over a lifetime that animals like people guarded their dignity. The wind gusted again, shaking the window panes. A branch somewhere outside thumped against the siding, and the pup flinched, his eyes darting to the sound. His breath quickened for a few beats, but as the moments passed and no harm followed, his posture eased again. Slowly, as though deciding that maybe this warmth wasn't a trap, he lowered himself onto the wool blanket. First the front paws folded, then the back legs tucked under his tail, curling alongside him. A sigh more like a shuddering release escaped him, and his head came down to rest on his paws. The steam from his coat mingled with the warmth of the room, a faint, earthy scent rising into the air. Harold leaned back onto his heels, watching him. "Brave," he said softly, testing the word. It felt right. This small creature had run headlong through the kind of storm that made grown men hesitate, and whatever had been chasing him had been no small threat. "Yes, brave. That would do." The pup's ears twitched faintly at the sound, but his eyes remained closed. The exhaustion was pulling him under quickly now. Outside, the wind howled and snow scraped against the siding in waves. But inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the stove fire and the slow rhythm of Brave's breathing. Harold stood and moved to the kitchen counter, picking up his mug and cradling it in both hands. He turned his gaze to the window, though there was nothing to see but the blur of white pressed against the glass. In the reflection, he caught the faint outline of his own face, lined and worn eyes tired, but still searching. He found his thoughts drifting, as they often did to Margaret. She had been gone 10 years now, but there were moments like this one when he could almost hear her voice. Kindness begins with opening the door to a small life, she had told him once, after bringing in a half-frozen kitten she'd found near the shed. She'd wrapped it in a towel, held it against her chest until it purred, and Harold had teased her about making the house into a barn. She'd just smiled that quiet smile that told him she didn't need to win the argument. Life itself would prove her right. He could see her even now, bending beside the stove, coaxing a reluctant stray to eat from her hand. She had a way with living things, a gentleness that never came across as weakness. Harold had tried to carry that forward after she was gone. But the house had grown quieter, and the chances to practice kindness had seemed fewer. Until tonight. Brave shifted slightly, curling tighter, and Harold noticed the faintest tremor still running through him. The storm had stolen much of his strength. It would take time and food to restore it. Harold made a note to heat some broth, something light for the pup's empty stomach, and maybe set out a pan of water warm just enough to keep from chilling him further. For now, though, the first fire of trust had been lit. The little shepherd had chosen to step toward the warmth rather than back into the cold, and Harold knew that choice mattered. In the quiet of the small wooden house, with the blizzard locked outside, an unspoken agreement had been made between man and dog tonight. Neither would face the storm alone. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world cloaked in a deceptive calm. By morning, the wind had died to a low sigh through the pines, and the sky hung pale and empty, as though it too was exhausted from the fight. Snow lay thick and untouched across the yard, glistening under the weak light that managed to filter through the clouds. Harold stood at the stove, pouring himself a mug of coffee, when he noticed Brave at the front window again. The young shepherd had been restless since waking, his body taut with a kind of energy that had nothing to do with playfulness. His paws pressed lightly against the sill nose, close to the cold glass eyes fixed on the far edge of the property, where the pines crowded together like sentinels. Every so often, a faint rumble came from deep in his throat. Not the sharp bark of alarm, but a low, almost thoughtful growl. His ears swiveled forward, then flicked back again, as if sifting sounds only he could hear beneath the muffled stillness. Harold walked over coffee, warming his palms, and stood behind him. "What do you see out there, boy?" Brave didn't turn his head, but his tail twitched once in acknowledgement. His breath fogged a small patch on the glass, and he pressed his nose into it, snuffling quietly. Then he stepped back, glanced over his shoulder at Harold, and let out a short, impatient whine. "All right," Harold said, after a moment. "Let's have a look, then." The cold slapped him full in the face when he opened the door. It was the kind of cold that stung the eyes and found its way into every seam of clothing, no matter how tightly pulled. Brave bounded out first, his paws sinking into the fresh powder, leaving sharp-edged prints behind. Harold followed more slowly, boots crunching through the crusted layer. The dog didn't head for the road or the open field beyond the barn. Instead, he trotted toward the side of the yard, nose down, tail rigid in concentration. His path took them to the far corner where the fence bent toward the tree line. The snow there was disturbed, not trampled entirely, but marked by the unmistakable signs of digging. Harold crouched his knees, complaining, and brushed away some of the loose powder. The marks were fresh. The sharp edges of the scrapes hadn't yet been softened by wind. It wasn't the work of claws tearing wildly, but more deliberate scraping down into the packed snow and the hard, frozen ground beneath. Beside the disturbed patch lay a scattering of tracks. They were smaller than Brave's, lighter in impression, but still clearly canine. paws no bigger than a teacup. Harold thought maybe younger than the dog standing beside him now. Brave sniffed the prints with quick, urgent breaths. Then he moved to the dig site again, lowering his nose until his whiskers brushed the snow. A faint whine escaped him, high-pitched and brief, before he lifted his head and looked directly at Harold. "What is it?" Harold murmured. He caught it then, a faint odor riding on the frozen air, something sour beneath the crisp scent of snow and pine. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to curl instinct through his gut. Brave stepped toward the trees, head low, ears forward. His body language changed. He was no longer just curious, he was following. The motion was deliberate, each paw placed as though the prints ahead were invisible but real to him. Harold hesitated, glancing toward the pines. They loomed dark, even under the gray daylight, their branches heavy with snow. The space between them was a tunnel of shadows. Brave paused just shy of the fence line, turning back to check on Harold, as if inviting him along. His tail gave a short flick, and his body leaned toward the forest. "All right," Harold said, voice low. "You lead, I'll follow." The dog's ears pricked at the words, but before he could take a step, the wind shifted. It came sliding down from the ridge, sharp and fast, carrying with it a fresh bite of ice. The gust rattled the pine branches, sending a thin veil of snow cascading down between the trunks. Brave froze, bracing against the sudden chill. For a long moment, he simply stood there, eyes locked on the tree line, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Then he backed away, turning toward Harold again. His ears were still forward, but there was caution now, reluctance. Harold studied him, the breath from his coffee earlier now replaced by vapor rising from his own lungs in the cold. He understood enough about animals to know that Brave hadn't lost interest. Something in the air, something carried by that gust, had told him to wait. The shepherd circled back toward the digging site once more, giving it a final sniff. Then he trotted toward the porch, pausing halfway to glance over his shoulder. The message was clear. Not now. Harold followed slowly, boots crunching, his mind sifting the details. Fresh digging, small paw prints, a sour scent in the cold. These weren't random. Brave had been looking toward the woods since dawn, and now he'd shown Harold this corner of the yard, like a man pointing to a locked door. Inside, Harold shut the door against the cold and stood for a while, rubbing the edge of his jaw. Brave settled by the window again, eyes tracking the same spot beneath the pines. "You've got something out there," Harold said quietly. "Something you want me to see." The dog's ears twitched at his voice, but his gaze never wavered. And Harold, standing there in the warmth of the little house, realized with a small weight in his chest that this was not the behavior of a dog, merely curious about another animal. No, Brave was searching for something important. Something that might be waiting right now in the cold shadow of the forest. The road into town was narrow, bordered by drifts of snow piled high from the plows. Harold drove slow, the old truck's heater huffing out warm but faintly metallic-smelling air. Beside him, Brave sat upright in the passenger's seat, his nose occasionally fogging the cold glass. The dog's gaze darted from the snow-covered storefronts to the pedestrians bundled in thick coats, as if cataloging every new sight. Harold had debated leaving him at home, but Brave's restless pacing that morning had made the decision for him. The dog had stood by the door, tail low but wagging faintly. Ears pricked every time Harold reached for his coat. "All right," Harold had finally sighed. "You're coming along." Town was busier than usual for a winter morning. The snow from yesterday's storm had been cleared from the sidewalks, leaving wet patches that caught the dull light filtering through the cloud cover. People moved briskly, heads tucked down, shopping bags clutched against the cold. Harold parked near the general store and stepped out, pulling his coat tight. Brave jumped down after him, paws landing lightly on the packed snow. His breath plumed into the air, each exhale quick and visible. The shepherd stuck close as they crossed the street, the faint jingle of his collar, borrowed from one of Harold's old dogs, marking his presence. It wasn't long before Harold noticed the stares. Folks who might have nodded a polite greeting instead let their eyes linger on Brave. Two men standing outside the hardware store paused their conversation entirely, following the pair with their gaze. A woman carrying a loaf of bread in a paper sack gave Harold a quick smile, but her eyes dropped to the dog almost immediately, narrowing slightly. It was the whispering that confirmed it. As Harold and Brave passed the post office, two younger men leaned toward each other, their voices low, but not low enough. "That's Red's dog," one muttered. "Sure looks like it," the other replied. "Heard it ran off last night." Harold's jaw tightened. He didn't break stride, but his eyes swept the street searching. He knew enough to expect trouble when Red Haskins' name came up. They reached the store, the bell above the door jangling as Harold stepped inside. Brave followed his nails, clicking softly against the worn linoleum. The warm air carried the mingled scents of coffee bread and the faint tang of gasoline from the back. Harold gathered what he needed: a sack of flour, some canned beans, lamp oil, keeping one hand loosely on the handle of Brave's leash. The dog was alert, but quiet, sniffing the air without tugging. When Harold stepped back outside, the cold air hit like a slap. And standing halfway down the block, framed by the pale backdrop of snow and weathered buildings, was Earl Red Haskins himself. Red was impossible to mistake, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a battered leather jacket that hung open despite the chill. His hair, the color of rust, stuck out from under a stained cap, and his eyes, sharp, pale blue, locked on Brave with a predator's focus. In his right hand, loosely held but visible, was the same long wooden stick Harold had seen the night before. He started walking toward them, slow and deliberate. People nearby seemed to find reasons to move aside, stepping into shops, crossing to the other side of the street without ever acknowledging him directly. When Red stopped a few feet away, the silence on that stretch of street felt heavier than the clouds above. "That's mine," he said, jerking his chin toward Brave. His voice was low, but carried edged with the kind of certainty that didn't invite discussion. "Ran off last night." Harold met his stare steady. "This dog showed up at my door. I didn't go looking for him." "Doesn't matter," Red replied, taking a half step closer. "He's mine, always has been. You can hand him over and we'll be square." Brave had pressed himself closer to Harold's leg the moment Red appeared. Now his tail was tucked tight under his belly and his ears pinned back. He didn't growl, but the tension in his body was clear. He was bracing not out of aggression, but out of fear. "I don't see a collar," Harold said evenly. "No tag, no mark on him that says he belongs to you. I don't need a tag to know what's mine." Red's pale eyes narrowed. "You think he wandered that far on his own?" "He ran because he's dumb, and now I'm here to take him back." "You don't have a say in it." I think Harold said, his voice calm but firm, that he ran for a reason. "And if he came to me, that's his choice. I'm not handing him over." Red's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was too thin, too cold. "Careful, old man. You don't want to make enemies in a town this small." The words hung between them like frost in the air. Brave pressed his side into Harold's knee, his head angled slightly toward the ground, but his eyes flicking up toward Red. The shepherd's chest rose and fell faster now, his breath sharp in the cold. For a moment, Harold thought Red might push it, reach for the leash, close the distance, force a scene. But instead, the man took a single step back, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said finally. He let the stick swing loosely in his grip, turning away as if he'd simply decided the conversation bored him. "I'll be seeing you." Red walked off down the street, his boots crunching against the snow, shoulders loose, but his head turning once to glance back over his shoulder. Harold didn't move until the man disappeared around the corner. Only then did he let out the slow breath he'd been holding. Brave's body was still taut against his leg, the dog's eyes fixed on the direction Red had gone. Harold reached down, resting his hand briefly on the shepherd's neck, not tugging, just steadying. "Come on," he said quietly. "We've got what we came for. Let's head home." They started back toward the truck, the whispers on the street resuming behind them. The town had returned to its normal rhythm, but Harold knew, just as surely as Brave did, that the air had shifted. Red Haskins wasn't the type to let something go, and a man like that, when crossed, always came back. The wind had eased, but the cold had not. The morning light was a pale wash over the landscape, turning the snow into a flat, blinding sheet that stretched all the way to the tree line. Harold pulled his coat tighter as he stepped off the porch, the crunch of his boots loud in the still air. Brave was already ahead of him, nose to the ground, tail straight out in a line of focus. For days, the shepherd had been looking toward the pines at the edge of the property, his attention unshaken, no matter what Harold tried to distract him with. This morning, he had taken it a step further, circling Harold with short, purposeful movements, until the old man relented. "All right," Harold had said, grabbing his gloves and hat. "Show me." They followed a faint track through the snow, the kind of path you wouldn't notice unless you'd walked it 100 times. Brave led with the confidence of one who knew every rise and hollow. The snow was deep enough to swallow Harold's boots nearly to the ankle in some places, and his breath steamed thick in front of him, but he kept pace as best he could. When they reached the tree line, the air changed. It always did inside the woods. The wind was muffled, the soundscape shifting to the creak of frozen branches and the occasional soft thud of snow dropping from a bough. But this time there was something else. A scent. Sharp, sour, and unmistakable. Harold slowed, breathing shallowly. What in the hell? Brave didn't answer, of course, but his movements quickened. He pushed through the drifts, with his chest paws churning until he came to a low rise. There, half hidden by the shadows, stood a structure that looked like it had been thrown together in a hurry years ago. Corrugated tin sheets, bent and rust-streaked, leaned against warped wooden planks. The whole thing sagged under the weight of snow, the roofline uneven and bowed. Harold felt his stomach knot. There was no reason for something like this to be out here. No hunting shack, no storage shed worth saving. It looked abandoned, but the scent in the air said otherwise. Then he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost thought he imagined it, a high-pitched whimper, thin as a thread. Brave's ears went up instantly. He darted to the right of the structure where the snowbank met a tangle of brush. The shepherd began digging without hesitation, his paws slicing through the crusted top layer. "Easy, boy," Harold said, moving to help, but Brave was relentless. Snow flew in sprays behind him, his breath coming in short bursts. Bit by bit, the hollow beneath was revealed dark against the whiteness, lined with frozen earth and bits of straw. And then Harold saw them. 3 tiny shapes huddled together, their fur matted and dusted with frost. They trembled so hard, it seemed their bones might rattle apart. Each was no bigger than a loaf of bread. Their eyes wide and unfocused, too young to make sense of the world beyond their immediate need for warmth. "God Almighty," Harold murmured, dropping to one knee. He pulled off his coat in one swift motion, ignoring the bite of cold against his shirt. With careful hands, he lifted the pups one by one, tucking them against the lining of the coat, wrapping the fabric tight around their shivering bodies. They made small, pitiful noises, the sound of creatures who had been cold too long. Brave hovered close, licking each pup in turn as Harold worked. His tongue swept gently over their ears, their tiny muzzles, as if checking that they were real and whole. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes, protective, almost fierce. "We're getting them out of here," Harold said firmly, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Brave or himself. He shifted the bundled pups in his arms, feeling the slight, desperate squirming against his chest. They were so light he could barely feel their weight, but the heat leaching from them told him they didn't have much time. The walk back felt longer, though the route was the same. Harold's steps were careful, trying not to jostle the fragile cargo in his arms. Brave moved ahead, then behind, then to the side, never more than a few feet away, his eyes scanning the trees as though expecting something to emerge. By the time they broke from the woods into the open field, Harold's fingers were stiff from gripping the coat closed. His breath burned in his chest, but he didn't slow. The house, with its dark wood siding and thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney, had never looked so welcome. Inside, the blast of warmth from the stove was like stepping into another world. Harold moved straight to the rocker by the fire, laying the coat on the seat and carefully unfolding it. The pups huddled closer together, their small bodies still trembling, but the heat from the room began to work its way into them. Brave nosed each one, his tongue darting out in soft, reassuring licks. He settled himself beside the chair close enough that his body heat added to the cocoon. Harold fetched an old wool blanket from the shelf and draped it gently over the pups, tucking the edges in to trap the warmth. "There now," he said quietly, as if speaking to a child. "You're safe. You've got a chance now." Brave's eyes met his, and in that look Harold saw gratitude and something else. An unspoken agreement. Whatever had left those pups out there in the cold, they both knew this was just the beginning. And Harold, feeling the steady pulse of life against his hands, realized he was ready for whatever came next. The wind had picked up again by late afternoon, brushing waves of powdery snow across the yard and rattling the bare branches of the trees. Inside Harold's kitchen, the wood stove burned bright, the air rich with the scent of coffee and the faint sweetness of cornbread warming in the oven. Brave lay stretched out near the stove, his head resting between his paws, eyes half closed. The 3 rescued pups were nestled in a padded box beside him, wrapped in layers of wool and fleece, the slow rise and fall of their tiny bodies. Proof that warmth and food were finally working their quiet magic. Harold had been pacing for the better part of an hour, his mug of coffee long gone cold in his hand. The discovery in the woods was still fresh in his mind. The smell of the place, the sight of the shivering pups, the sagging tin walls of that makeshift structure. He knew with a certainty that felt heavy in his bones that there were more animals still trapped there. The knock at the door came just as he set the mug down. Mrs. Elvira Brooks stepped in first, bundled in a thick green coat with a fur-lined hood, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed and practical, the kind of neighbor who remembered every detail of a story you told her years ago. Behind her came Lily Harper, a young woman in her 20s, with dark hair tucked into a knitted cap, her phone already in her hand, as though she had been expecting to use it. Tom Jenkins, a broad-shouldered man in a denim jacket dusted with snow, brought up the rear, stamping his boots on the mat. The kitchen filled quickly with the sounds of greeting, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of coats being shed, the hiss of the kettle as Harold set it back on the stove for a fresh round of coffee. "You said it was urgent," Mrs. Brooks prompted as she settled into a chair. Her gaze flicked toward the pups in the box, then to Brave. "I suppose it has to do with them." Harold nodded, pouring steaming water into 3 mugs. "Found them this morning, out past the tree line. They wouldn't have lasted another night." Where Tom asked, leaning forward, his forearms on the table. "About a quarter-mile into the woods," Harold said. "Near an old structure, tin and wood falling apart but still standing. The smell was..." He paused, searching for the word. "Rotten. Like waste that's been sitting too long." Mrs. Brooks's mouth tightened. "That sounds like the place folks have whispered about for years. Belongs to Earl Haskins." "That's what I'm thinking," Harold admitted. "And I'm thinking those 3 aren't the only ones out there." Brave lifted his head at the sound of Harold's voice, ears pricking. He didn't move from his place by the stove, but his attention was fixed on the group as if he understood that their talk involved him. "So what do we do?" Tom asked. Lily set her phone down on the table, the screen lighting briefly, before dimming again. "We expose it," she said simply. "If we can get inside, take video of what's really going on, we put it online. Let people see for themselves." "No rumors, no he said, she said, just proof." Mrs. Brooks raised a skeptical brow. "And you think that'll be enough to make him stop?" "It might not stop him by itself," Lily said, "but it'll put eyes on him. If enough people are watching, he won't be able to hide it. And it'll give the authorities something they can't ignore." Harold leaned back in his chair, considering. He's not the type to invite visitors. Getting close won't be easy. "That's why we plan it," Lily replied. "We go when he's least likely to be there. And we go together. The more of us, the harder it'll be for him to push us off without drawing attention." Tom gave a short nod. Strength in numbers. Outside the window, snowflakes began to drift down again, lazy at first, but thickening quickly. The glass glowed faintly from the kitchen light, the darkness beyond it broken only by the swirling white. Harold looked around the table, seeing the same mix of unease and resolve in each face. "It's a risk," he said, "but I can't sleep knowing there are animals freezing out there. We've got the stove, the blankets, the food we can take them in. We just have to get them here." Mrs. Brooks reached for her coffee, her hand steady. "Then we go." A quiet settled over the kitchen, not of hesitation, but of agreement. The decision had been made. Lily leaned forward, tapping her phone. "I can bring my camera gear, better than just a phone. We'll need lights too, in case it's dark inside. I've got a couple of old lanterns in the shed," Harold offered. Tom added, "And I know the back road that gets close without passing his place." Less chance of running into him. They spoke in turns, voices overlapping at times, the conversation weaving into a plan. Brave finally stood padding over to the table. He rested his chin lightly on Harold's knee, eyes flicking from face to face, his body language calm but intent. Harold reached down, ruffling the fur between his ears. "We're going to need you too, boy. You know the way." The dog's tail gave one slow, measured wag. Outside, the snow kept falling, cloaking the street and the rooftops in white. Inside, the warmth of the stove and the scent of coffee wrapped around them. All the hum of shared purpose more powerful than the wind's moan at the windows. It wasn't just Harold's fight anymore. The fire had spread quiet, steady, and determined through the small kitchen and into the hearts of everyone gathered there. And in that moment, as Brave turned to settle again near the stove, Harold knew they would see it through, no matter what it took. The world was black ice and shadows when they set out. Snow still drifted down in a fine, silent veil, muting the landscape, wrapping it in a hush that felt heavier than quiet. Harold walked near the front of the small column, his scarf pulled high over his mouth, the air in his lungs raw with cold. Brave trotted just ahead, each step precise, the dark saddle of his fur nearly invisible against the night. 6 of them moved together: Harold, Mrs. Elvira Brooks, Lily, Harper, Tom Jenkins, and 2 more neighbors, Frank Dalton and Nora Mills. They had no torches lit yet, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness. The only light was the dim halo from the town's street lamps far behind them, and the pale glint of snow reflecting what little glow bled through the clouds. The snow was deep enough to swallow the sound of their footfalls. Even the creak of boots was muffled. The quiet was broken only by the occasional snap of an ice-coated twig underfoot, a sound that made everyone stiffen and glance toward the tree line. Tom led them along the back road, the one that skirted the ridge, and dropped toward the woods behind Red Haskins' property. Half a mile more, he murmured over his shoulder, his breath showing in a faint cloud. Brave didn't need directions. His head was low nose, close to the snow, reading scents the rest of them couldn't sense. Every so often, his ears twitched toward some faint, distant sound, but he kept moving, body tight with purpose. The fence appeared first tall, sagging in places, the chain link rimmed with frost that glittered faintly under the falling snow. Harold's eyes found the spot Lily had described during their planning, a warped section where the bottom had pulled away, from the frozen ground, leaving a jagged gap just big enough for a person to squeeze through. One by one they crouched and slid into the darkness beyond, careful to keep their clothing from snagging on the wire. Brave slipped through first, his paws landing in the packed snow inside the enclosure without a sound. The smell hit them immediately. Even in the cold, it was strong ammonia rot and something sour that clung to the back of the throat. Nora gagged softly, pulling her scarf tighter over her face. They moved forward, stepping between patches of shadow and faint pools of moonless light cast by the dim glow of a single bulb above a sagging shed. The ground was uneven, churned with ice and trampled snow. Ahead, the faint outlines of kennels took shape, rectangular silhouettes lined in rows, some covered with tarps stiff with frost, others bare to the winter air. Lily clicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. 24 small reflective glints blinked back eyes. Dozens of them. Dogs huddled in cramped cages, their bodies curled tight against the cold, some rising at the light only to shrink back again. Muzzles poked through the wire breaths, fogging the metal tails still. God, Harold breathed. Mrs. Brooks stepped closer to one cage, her hand hovering just short of the bars. Inside, a small hound shivered violently, its ribs sharp against thin fur. "Keep moving," Tom urged in a low voice. "We get it all on camera first." Lily raised her phone and began recording, sweeping the light slowly across the rows. The beam caught the sheen of frost on metal bowls, the dark stains on the snow beneath the cages. The silence was worse than barking. It was the quiet of animals too tired to protest anymore. Then from somewhere deeper in the shadows came a sound that changed the air, a slow metallic scrape, like chain being dragged across frozen ground. Brave's head snapped up, ears forward. The hair along his spine rose in a ridge. "Did you hear that?" Nora whispered. The answer came before anyone could reply. Tung Tranduga. The words, though foreign in their language, carried the unmistakable edge of mockery. Earl Red Haskins' voice was like gravel dragged over steel, slow, deliberate, meant to carry. A hard slam followed. The heavy front gate of the compound swung shut with a clang that echoed through the stillness. In the same instant, harsh white light exploded across the yard. Flood lamps mounted on tall poles flared to life, banishing the shadows and laying everything bare. The sudden brightness burned in Harold's eyes after so long in the dark. The snow illuminated from above reflected the glare upward, throwing hard shadows under every line of chain link. Red stood in the open space between two kennels, flanked by two men Harold didn't recognize. Both wore thick coats, faces set in hard lines. One held a length of pipe, the other a looped rope that hung loose but ready. Red's stick was in his hand, tapping lightly against his palm. His mouth curved in a smile that didn't reach his pale eyes. "Well," he drawled, stepping forward, "look what wandered in." Brave moved instantly, positioning himself between Harold and Red, his body low but rigid teeth just visible. His growl was steady, deep enough to vibrate in Harold's bones. No one spoke for a heartbeat. The snowflakes drifted lazily between them, catching in the floodlight. Somewhere behind one of the caged dogs let out a low, uncertain whine. Harold's eyes flicked to the men on either side of Red, then back to the man himself. "We're here for the dogs," he said evenly, his breath steaming in the cold. Red's smile widened, though it carried no warmth. "Oh, I know exactly what you're here for." He glanced at the rows of cages. "But these aren't yours to take." Lily raised her phone higher, keeping it trained on him, the recording light blinking. "They're not yours either," she said, her voice tight. One of Red's men shifted the rope in his hand, swaying. Brave's growl deepened the sound, low and dangerous. The floodlights hummed overhead, the harsh glare showing every flake of snow, every breath, every tense line of muscle. In Harold's gut, he knew this was the point of no return. The tension snapped like brittle ice under a boot. The man with the rope lunged forward, his breath pluming in the frozen air, swinging the loop in a swift, practiced arc. Brave moved faster than thought, just a flash of tan and black fur breaking from Harold's side. His paws struck the man square in the chest with a heavy thump, driving him backward into the churned snow. The breath left the man in a ragged grunt as Brave's jaws locked hard around his forearm. The rope slipped from his fingers, tumbling uselessly to the ground. "Get him off!" the man shouted, thrashing under the dog's weight. Snow erupted around them, scattering into the floodlight glare. Brave adjusted his footing, front paws digging deep, his growl vibrating low and dangerous, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Harold's instinct pulled him forward, but Lily's voice cut clean through the chaos. "Don't keep filming." She was already moving camera high, the red recording light blinking like a pulse in the dark. The lens caught it all, the violent tangle in the snow. The raw fury tightening Red's features as he closed in the floodlights, throwing harsh shadows that carved the yard into shards of light and blackness. Without warning, Red's stick came down. It cracked across Brave's flank, the sound muffled by snow, but sharp enough that Harold felt it in his bones. Brave yelped, teeth loosening just long enough for the man beneath him to scramble away, clutching his arm and staggering toward the fence. "Stay back!" Harold's voice was iron, his boots planting between Lily and Red as the man advanced again. Behind them, Mrs. Brooks and Tom had reached the first row of cages. Tom wrenched at a frozen latch until it gave way with a jagged snap. The door swung open on rusted hinges, and 3 dogs burst into the snow, slipping and scrambling for their footing before bolting toward the shadows. Mrs. Brooks' gloved hands fought another latch. This one yielded to a shove, freeing a thin shepherd mix that stumbled out its body, trembling violently against the cold. Lily's camera darted between scenes. Brave circling to guard Harold's flank, Red's shadow looming. Tom and Mrs. Brooks flinging open doors as Frank and Nora worked a second row, their breath rising in clouds under the floodlights. Then Harold saw him. At the far end, a crooked cage door hung open just enough for a shape to emerge. A dog stepped into the light, each movement deliberate as though every muscle protested. His coat was gray, streaked with tan, worn thin in places where fur had fallen away. One hind leg hovered just above the ground, stiff with old injury, and his eyes deep amber, unwavering, locked on Brave, across the noise and cold. Brave went still. His tail froze mid-sweep, ears rigid, as if straining to confirm what his eyes saw. He took a step forward, then another, the hesitation melting until he pressed his muzzle through the bars. The older dog stepped close, noses touching, and Brave's composure shattered. He licked frantically, sweeping his tongue over the older dog's muzzle again and again, tail wagging in trembling bursts, as if afraid the figure before him might vanish. "Is that—" Lily's voice cracked. "It's his father," Harold said, low enough it nearly vanished under the wind. A sudden shout ripped through the yard. One of Red's men lunged at Tom, but Tom met him with a shove that sent the man sprawling into a snowbank. Red spun toward Mrs. Brooks' stick, lifting again, but Harold moved faster, stepping in with a glare that rooted the bigger man in place. "Back away," Harold said, his voice flat steel. From beyond the fence, a sound began, thin at first, then swelling into a wail. Sirens. Their pitch curled through the trees like a warning from the mountains themselves. Red's head snapped toward the sound, eyes narrowing. "You called the cops?" Lily didn't waste breath on an answer. The camera stayed fixed on him, capturing the twitch in his jaw, the dark flare of rage across his features as the sirens grew louder. Harold's hands found the older dog's latch. It groaned open metal, scraping against metal. Brave stepped back just far enough for his father to limp free, then pressed himself close again, muzzle burrowing under the older dog's chin. The father leaned into him, shutting his eyes, his shoulders sagging in a release that looked almost like surrender. The yard had become a storm, dogs streaming through the open gate paws, scattering snow and ice, voices shouting over the blare of sirens that now pulsed through the floodlight haze. Red advanced once more, stick raised for a final swing. But Brave moved to stand before his father, teeth bared in a snarl that froze the moment. The sound was pure warning, ancient and unshakable, and Red halted mid-step. Harold swept his gaze over the scene, the cages yawning open, the freed dogs vanishing into the shadows, the long frantic shadows spilling across the snow. Beyond the fence, flashes of red and blue sliced through the black pines. And in that breath, Harold understood the tide had turned. What was once Red's ground was now slipping away under his boots, one heartbeat at a time. The sirens grew into a howl that swallowed the night, the sound bouncing off the sheet metal walls and rolling across the snow-covered clearing like a storm surge. The glare of red and blue strobes began to strobe against the tree trunks beyond the fence, turning the drifting flakes into sparks of color. Brave stayed planted in the snow, his body tense, ears forward, every muscle quivering with readiness. His father pressed close behind him, leaned his head lightly against Brave's shoulder, breathing slow and shallow, as if the chaos around them was too much to track. Harold kept one hand on Brave's back, feeling the rigid line of muscle under the thick fur, and with the other, he reached to steady the older dog. Then the first patrol car skidded to a halt just beyond the gate tires, spitting slush. Its headlights cut through the yard, painting Red and his men in blinding light. Another cruiser followed, then a third. Doors slammed, boots crunched on ice, and the sharp voices of officers carried through the cold. Police, stay where you are. Two officers in dark winter jackets swept through the open gate service lights, bobbing as they moved. Behind them more followed, fanning out in practiced arcs. The sight of their badges and the sure way they held themselves shifted the air immediately. The fear and uncertainty that had hung over the yard gave way to something tighter, steadier. Red took a half-step back, his gaze darting from the nearest officer to the fence line, as if calculating an escape. His two remaining men froze under the officer's advance, but their eyes were restless, twitching to the shadows. One officer closed in on Red, voice sharp. Hands where I can see them. Red's lip curled. You've got no... The command came again, harder now. Hands up. For a moment, Harold thought Red might comply, but then the man's hand darted toward his belt. The metallic glint that caught in the floodlight was unmistakable, a knife, its short blade catching the cold white shine. Knife, someone shouted. Time compressed into a heartbeat. Harold didn't think. He moved. In two strides, he was there, shoulder driving into Red's arm before the blade could swing outward. The impact jarred through Harold's bones. The knife clattered to the snow, spinning once before settling flat. Brave barked deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to shake the air. He stepped forward, planting himself directly between his father and the threat teeth flashing white in the light. The older dog, though limping, squared his stance beside his son, head low, eyes locked on Red. The officers surged in. One seized Red's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with a precision born of repetition. Another kicked the knife further into the snow before stooping to pick it up with gloved hands. The cuffs clicked shut around Red's wrists, the sound sharp as breaking ice. Even then, Red didn't go quietly. His voice rose in a snarl, words tumbling out in a string of threats. You think this changes anything? You think you can take what's mine? You'll regret this, every one of you. The officer holding him tightened the grip on his arm. That's enough. You're done. Harold stood close-breath, steaming in the frigid air, his heart still thudding from the collision. His eyes met Red's. For a single moment, there was no triumph in Harold's gaze, only the quiet, unshakable certainty that this was the end of whatever hold Red had on this place. Around them, the rest of the yard was settling into controlled motion. The second officer had Red's men face down in the snow cuffs, biting their wrists, as the freed dogs weaved nervously among the humans, some hovering near the open gate, others circling back to sniff at the cages they had left. Brave's attention never left his father. Every time a shadow moved too close, his ears flicked forward, his body tilting just enough to shield the older dog from view. Harold could feel the steadying weight of that presence, the instinctive barrier Brave created without being told. Mrs. Brooks appeared from the far side of the yard, one arm hooked around Lily's shoulder. Lily still clutched her phone, its screen glowing faintly, the recording light still blinking. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Got it all," she said quietly to Harold. "Every second of it." Tom and Nora emerged next, each holding onto the collar of a dog, too nervous to move freely in the crush of activity. Frank was at the gate waving another officer in and guiding a group of freed dogs toward the warmth of an open van. "Let's get them out of here," Harold said, nodding toward Brave and his father. One of the officers, a woman with frost dusting the brim of her cap, stepped forward. Without hesitation, she shrugged off the heavy blanket draped over her arm and crouched. "Here," she said, wrapping it first around the older dog's shoulders, then folding it snugly across Brave's back. The fabric trapped a faint layer of warmth, and Brave's eyes softened just slightly at the contact. The older dog leaned into Harold's legs, trembling. Not from fear, Harold thought, but from the slow release of strain that came when survival was no longer the only thing holding him upright. With Red and his men loaded into patrol cars, the last of the floodlights began to dim. The harsh shadows softened into the natural gray-blue of winter night. Snow continued to fall, dusting the scene in a thin, almost peaceful layer that belied the chaos of minutes before. "Let's move," Harold said quietly. He crouched, slipping one arm under the older dog's chest and another behind his hindquarters. The dog was lighter than expected, too light, and Harold felt a surge of anger at the neglect that had whittled him down to bone and sinew. Brave stayed close, pacing each of Harold's steps as if tethered by an invisible line. Mrs. Brooks held the gate for them, and beyond it, the road waited lined with police vehicles. The red and blue lights strobed over the snow, casting fleeting otherworldly colors across the trees. People stood in small clusters, neighbors who had followed the noise, and sirens. Faces turned toward Harold and the dogs. There was no mistaking what they saw, a man carrying an injured animal. Another dog pressed so close, he could have been part of the same body. They reached the van Frank had readied. Its back doors stood open, warmth spilling out from a portable heater inside. Blankets lay folded along the floor, ready for whoever needed them. Harold stepped in, lowering the older dog gently onto the softest pile. Brave climbed in after him, curling immediately against his father's side, his head resting over the older dog's shoulder. The others began to file in dogs, from the yard, each finding a patch of blanket or the comfort of a human hand. The hum of conversation rose softly inside, the kind of low, steady talk that followed crisis, where every word was underpinned by relief. Outside, an officer leaned into Harold. "We'll need statements from everyone. But for now." His gaze shifted to Brave and the older dog. "They're safe. That's what matters most tonight." Harold nodded, his hand resting lightly on Brave's back. The dog's breathing was slowing, the tension in his muscles easing at last. The older dog's eyes half closed, his head lowering until it rested fully against his son's. The last sound Harold heard before the van doors closed was the crunch of boots on snow as the police led Red away. The man's voice had gone hoarse, but the threat still spilled out, trailing into the night like smoke. They no longer carried weight. Not here. Not anymore. Inside the van, the warmth wrapped around them like a shield. Snow tapped softly against the roof, a sound so gentle it felt almost impossible after the clash of moments before. Harold looked at Brave and his father, two shadows against the blankets. Their breathing now in sync, and felt the first real swell of calm since the night began. Outside, the engines, started tires crackling on frozen gravel. The convoy began to move, carrying them away from the yard, away from Red, and toward whatever came next. The fight wasn't over. Harold knew that, but tonight the balance had shifted, and justice had taken its first firm hold. And in the warm, dim light of the van, Brave lifted his head just long enough to meet Harold's eyes. The look was clear, unspoken, and unwavering. "We go together." The rescue shelter was nothing fancy, just a converted barn on the edge of town. But that night, under the weight of snow on its roof and the glow of lamplight spilling through its windows, it felt like a fortress. Inside, the air was warm and thick, with a mingled sense of wood smoke, damp fur, and the faint sweetness of tea steeping in the corner. Harold eased the door shut against the cold, the latch clicking softly. Brave trotted in ahead of him, glancing over his shoulder to be sure Harold was close, then turning his attention back to the older dog he had guarded so fiercely. The shelter's main room had been arranged to welcome them. Blankets layered over straw mats, cushions stacked along the walls, and the wood-burning stove at the far end, glowing with a steady orange heart. The older dog moved stiffly, his paws pressing into the warmth of the blankets like he wasn't sure they were real. Brave stayed so close their shoulders brushed his head, lowering each time his father hesitated. The moment they reached the stove's reach, Harold lowered himself into a crouch, resting a hand lightly against the older dog's side. "There you go," Harold murmured, as though speaking to a child. "Safe now, both of you." From the stove, a kettle began to whistle a soft rising sound that somehow felt like the most human thing in the room. Lily appeared from the small kitchen at the side, her hair damp from melted snow, a wool shawl draped over her shoulders. She carried 2 mugs, steam curling from their rims. "Tea for us," she said, setting one beside Harold. "And some broth for them." Mrs. Elvira Brooks followed her in carrying a pot that sent the rich smell of chicken drifting through the air. Behind them, Tom Jenkins and Nora shuffled through the doorway, each with their arms full of folded blankets. In the far corner, the 3 rescued puppies were curled together, their bellies rising and falling in the deep, dreamless rhythm of creatures who had finally stopped running. Their fur, still faintly spiky from drying, caught the light in a way that made them look like tiny embers on the floor. Harold took his mug, wrapping both hands around it for the heat, and let his eyes wander the room. The space was alive, in a way it hadn't been just days ago. People moved quietly but with purpose, laying out bedding, refilling the wood bin, checking the latches on the windows to keep out drafts. It wasn't the kind of order born from habit, it was the kind born from the sudden knowledge that something fragile had been saved and needed protecting. Brave eased himself onto the blankets beside his father. The 2 of them settling so close, their sides seemed to blend into one shape. Brave's head rested lightly across the older dog's shoulders, and as the stove's heat reached them, Harold saw the rhythm of their breathing align. It was subtle, barely noticeable, unless you watched long enough, but it was there. Lily sank onto the bench beside Harold, tucking her hands into the sleeves of her sweater. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "so as not to disturb the dogs. We need more than just tonight. They'll need food, medical care, a plan. And not just for them. There are still others out there." Harold nodded, eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of Brave's chest. "We start here. Make sure they're strong. After that, we figure the rest." Mrs. Brooks stepped closer, her hands folded over her apron. "People will help. I've already spoken to a few neighbors. They're bringing food blankets. Someone even offered to donate firewood." She glanced toward the stove with a faint smile. "We'll keep it burning for as long as it takes." The shelter door opened again, letting in a gust of wind that carried flakes across the floor before it shut. This time, it was Frank stomping snow from his boots. He set down a crate on the table, revealing cans of dog food, jars of honey, and a stack of folded towels. From the cafe, he explained, and a few folks who couldn't make it out here tonight but wanted to send something. One by one, more people arrived. They came with baskets, bags, and quiet voices. Someone brought a stack of quilts from their grandmother's attic, the fabric soft from years of use. Another brought a tin of biscuits for the volunteers. Every new arrival paused to look toward Brave and his father, their expressions shifting to something gentler at the sight. As the night deepened, the sound of the wind outside faded to a muffled hum blocked by the barn's thick walls. Inside, the only noises were the occasional crackle of the stove, the whisper of boots across the floor, and the soft sighs of dogs drifting into sleep. Harold sipped his tea slowly, letting its warmth chase the lingering cold from his bones. He thought about the road ahead, the vet visits, the repairs the shelter would need before it could handle more rescues, the inevitable trouble that might still come from Red's threats. But in that moment, those thoughts were distant. What mattered was here. Brave's steady gaze whenever Harold moved, the older dog's breathing finally free of strain, the puppies pressed together in a tangle of paws and tails. It was a scene so ordinary, it almost hurt to look at ordinary, in the way that made you realize how rare it truly was. Lily set her empty mug down. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll start putting the video together. If we share it more, people will see what's been happening. Maybe enough will care to make it stop." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "They will. You'll see." Harold glanced toward the window where frost feathered the edges of the glass. Somewhere beyond that, the forest still held its silence, and snow was falling over the footprints they had left hours earlier. The thought brought a strange kind of comfort that whatever had happened tonight would stay here in this pocket of warmth, untouched by the cold outside. By the time the last visitor left and the door was bolted, the room had settled into quiet. Harold took the last turn at the stove, adding 2 more logs and watching the flames catch. The light danced across the dog's fur, painting it gold in places and deepening the shadows in others. Brave shifted slightly in his sleep, his front paw stretching out until it rested against Harold's boot. The older dog stirred, opening one eye, then closing it again with a long exhale. Harold crouched, his hand brushing along Brave's neck, then to the ridge of muscle along his father's back. "You're safe," he whispered. "Both of you." Brave's ear flicked as though he'd heard, and Harold decided that was enough. The kettle on the stove gave a soft sigh as the water inside cooled. The embers settled. Outside, the snow would keep falling through the night, covering the town in white by morning. But here in the shelter's warm heart, the breathing of 2 dogs, one young, one old, rose and fell in the same quiet rhythm. And for now, that was all that mattered. The snow had begun to melt in slow, reluctant drips from the eaves, leaving wet streaks down the shelter's wooden walls. Weeks had passed since the night of the raid, and the world outside the barn seemed softer now, less like a frozen cage and more like a place where spring might be brave enough to arrive. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the familiar scent of wood smoke and the faint aroma of fresh bread someone had left on the table that morning. Brave lay near the open barn door, paws stretched toward the sunlight, spilling in across the floorboards. Hunter, the older shepherd, rested a few feet away on a thick blanket, his body still lean, but stronger than it had been. His coat, once dulled and patchy now, shone faintly in the light, and though his limp would never truly vanish, he moved with an ease that spoke of healing. The past weeks had been filled with simple, steady moments, Hunter leaning into Harold's hands as the man brushed out the winter tangles from his fur. Lily crouching to feed him bits of cooked chicken, the way Brave would always position himself between his father and the door, as if some part of him still kept guard. That afternoon, Harold was mending a latch on one of the inside gates when Lily stepped in from the yard, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She held a folded piece of paper in one hand, her eyes bright. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Harold looked up. "Try me." She unfolded the paper, revealing a printed photograph worn at the corners like it had been carried for years. The image was of a younger Hunter, his coat a richer mix of gold and black, standing beside a smiling couple, and a boy who looked to be no more than 10. The boy's arm was slung loosely over the dog's neck, and Hunter's eyes were exactly the same as they were now. Deep amber, steady, full of a kind of watchfulness that could never be taught. They saw the video, Lily explained. Recognized him instantly. They've been looking for him for almost 3 years. Harold set the hammer aside. They're sure. They're on their way now, she said. Her voice almost hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. Should be here in about an hour. Harold glanced toward Hunter, who was lifting his head at the sound of their voices. Let's make sure he's ready. By the time the knock came at the barn door, the stove had been stoked high, the floor swept, and Hunter brushed until his coat lay smooth. Brave stayed close, watching every movement, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Harold opened the door, and the cold air carried in the scent of pine and the faint crunch of boots on packed snow. Standing there was a man and a woman, both in heavy winter coats, their eyes scanning the barn until they landed on the dog behind Harold. The man's breath caught audibly. "Hunter," he whispered. The woman stepped forward, her gloved hands trembling. "Oh my God, it's really him." Harold moved aside and Hunter rose slowly, ears tilting forward. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the man crouched down, removing his gloves, his voice breaking. "Buddy, it's us. It's home." Hunter took a cautious step forward, then another. His nose lifted, scenting the air, and suddenly the space between them closed. He pressed his head into the man's chest tail, moving in slow, sweeping arcs. The woman dropped to her knees beside them, wrapping her arms around the dog's shoulders, her face buried in his fur. Brave stood a few feet away, watching his head tilted. Lily rested a hand lightly on his back. "That's his family," she murmured. The man looked up, eyes shining. We thought we'd lost him forever. He got out during a storm, ran off after a deer. We searched for weeks. Posters, calls, everything. And then, nothing." His voice wavered. "We never stopped hoping." Harold cleared his throat. "He's been through a lot, but he's strong. You can see that." The woman reached for Brave, her palm gentle against his head. "You must be the one who kept him safe." Brave leaned into the touch for a moment, then stepped back toward Hunter, giving his father a small, insistent nudge with his muzzle. They stayed for nearly an hour, talking softly while Hunter lay between them, soaking in their voices and their touch. Harold went over the details, how they'd need to monitor his limp. The food that agreed with him, the way he liked to sleep near the warmest spot in the room. The family listened carefully every now and then, exchanging a glance that was equal parts joy and disbelief. When it came time to leave, the man clipped a new collar around Hunter's neck, the leather soft and smelling faintly of cedar. Hunter stood without protest, but before he followed them to the door, he turned toward Brave. The two dogs touched noses, their foreheads leaning together in a stillness that seemed to hush the entire room. Brave's tail gave a slow wag, and Hunter's ears relaxed, his eyes closing for the briefest second. Outside, the family's SUV was parked by the fence, the back open and lined with blankets. Brave followed them all the way to the gate paws, crunching in the snow. Hunter paused at the threshold, glancing back once. Brave stepped forward, closing the space until their muzzles brushed. Then, with a quiet chuff, Hunter climbed into the car. The man closed the back gently, as if sealing something precious inside. The engine started and the tires began to roll. Brave trotted alongside for several steps, his breath clouding in the cold air before he slowed. The vehicle's taillights glowed red against the white road, growing smaller with each passing second. Brave stood there until the car disappeared beyond the bend. His ears stayed forward, his gaze steady, and though his chest rose a little faster than usual, there was no tension in him, no fear of loss, only the quiet certainty that his father was going home. Lily knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "He's safe," she whispered. "You gave him that." Harold watched from the fence, the winter sun catching the frost in his beard. In the stillness that followed, he felt something settle, a kind of peace that didn't erase the past, but wove it into the present, turning it into something that could be carried forward. Brave finally turned, padding back toward the barn. The warmth inside greeted them, and as the door closed behind Harold, knew this was not an ending. It was simply another beginning, one built on the knowledge that sometimes letting go was the truest way to hold on. The days after Hunter's departure fell into a rhythm, the kind of steady, purposeful routine that had always anchored Harold through the storms of his life. Yet the barn felt different now. Where there had been two shepherds lying side by side, there was only one. And that one Brave seemed to fill the empty space with a new kind of presence. He had taken to sitting near the main gate each morning, his posture tall and alert, watching the road beyond the fence. Harold knew he wasn't expecting Hunter to come back. Dogs didn't hold to that kind of longing the way people did. But Brave seemed to understand that this spot gave him a vantage point over all who came and went. He had become the unofficial sentinel of the shelter, his amber eyes tracking every movement with a calm assurance that settled the nervous energy of the new arrivals. It was early winter again, though the season had not yet tightened its grip. The snow fell in small, deliberate flakes, each one twisting lazily on the cold air before settling on the frozen earth. The trees stood bare along the shelter's perimeter, their dark limbs scribbling against the pale sky. Inside the barn, the wood stove glowed, sending up a slow ribbon of heat that bent and wavered above the iron surface. That afternoon, a pickup truck rattled up the gravel drive. Harold looked up from the feed sacks he was stacking and saw the driver, a middle-aged woman with wind-burned cheeks, step out cupping her hands to call to him. "Got 2 more for you," she said. "Found 'em near the old rail yard." Brave was already on his feet, moving to stand beside Harold as the woman opened the truck's back. 2 young dogs, thin, shivering, their fur dull with road dust, stood uncertainly in the bed, their eyes darting between the strangers. Harold climbed up to them, slowly speaking in a low voice, his hands steady. Brave remained at the edge, tail low, but wagging his gaze soft. The pups took hesitant steps toward Harold, but it was Brave they kept glancing at, as if measuring his reaction. When he lowered his head and gave a quiet chuff, they inched closer, and Harold was able to lift them down. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately. The pups' ears twitched at the crackle of the fire, the smell of cooking broth drifting from the corner where Lily was bent over a pot. She looked up, her face softening. More lost souls found. Near the rail yard, Harold said, setting the smaller one on a thick folded blanket. Brave padded over, circling them once, before lying down a short distance away, his head resting on his paws. The pups relaxed almost at once, drawn into the quiet gravity he seemed to carry. Lily ladled broth into shallow bowls, the steam curling upward in fragrant ribbons. "You know," she said to Harold as she set the bowls down, "he's more than just a guard now. He's teaching them." Harold nodded. Sometimes the best lessons don't need words. The days shortened quickly, the sun skimming the horizon before dropping into long shadows that wrapped around the barn. Winter's hand grew heavier, but inside the shelter felt like an ember in the snow, a place where warmth held its ground. The stove never went out, its low roar, and the occasional pop of resin from the logs marking the hours. Brave moved easily among the dogs, his presence never forceful, but always felt. When new rescues came in, limping, shaking eyes wide, he was there, letting them sniff him, letting them share his space, until the sharp edge of their fear dulled. At night, when the wind moaned against the siding, Harold sometimes found Brave lying just inside the door as though keeping watch over the sleeping barn. One evening, as the last light faded, Harold stood at the window looking out at the yard. Snow was falling again, softer this time, each flake catching the glow of the floodlight like drifting sparks. Brave was out there, sitting in the quiet, his breath visible in the cold air. The pups from the rail yard had followed him, curling up against his side. Harold felt something catch in his chest, a small tightening, not of pain, but of recognition. The sight pulled up an old memory, his wife standing in the doorway of their farmhouse years ago. A stray cat cradled in her arms, the winter wind tugging at her scarf. She had looked at him with that steady, unflinching gaze of hers and said, "A home is when no one is left outside the door." The words came back to him now with the same quiet force they'd carried then, and he let them settle into the moment, anchoring it. Inside, the firelight washed the walls in amber, the shadows moving like slow tides. Lily had set out mugs of tea on the table, the steam rising in thin, wavering columns. The dogs, pups, and old-timers alike lay scattered across blankets and mats. Their bodies curved into the shapes of rest, the air filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. Brave came in from the yard, snowflakes melting on his fur. He shook once, sending tiny droplets into the air, and crossed the room to settle near the stove. One of the younger dogs immediately moved to press against him, and Brave lowered his head over the pup's back, his eyes half closing. Harold took a seat by the fire, stretching his legs toward the warmth. He watched the shepherd's steady breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, in time with the pup's smaller rhythm. "You know," Lily said softly from across the table, "if it weren't for him, some of these dogs might never have trusted us." Harold smiled faintly. "Second chances," he said. "That's what we give here." "And what he gives them," Lily added. The wind pressed against the walls, then a hollow sound that only made the inside seem warmer. Outside, the snow kept falling, layering the ground in white. Inside, the fire burned steady, the air rich with the smell of wood smoke and tea. Later, after the lamps had been turned low, Harold made his rounds. He walked past each sleeping form, adjusting blankets, checking the latch on the door. Brave lifted his head briefly as Harold approached, then set it down again, satisfied. Harold stood there for a moment looking at him. The shepherd's eyes caught the firelight, glinting amber, and Harold felt the weight of everything that had led to this point, the nights of danger, the moments of fear, the sharp relief of rescue. He thought again of his wife's words, and the truth in them felt larger than the walls around him. In a world that could be so cold, sometimes the smallest acts, opening a door, offering a blanket standing watch when others slept, were the ones that changed everything. He reached down, resting a hand on Brave's shoulder. "You keep watch, partner," he murmured. "I'll keep the fire." Brave's tail thumped once against the floor. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world outside lay quiet and untouched, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry farther. Harold stepped out with a mug of coffee, the air crisp in his lungs. Brave trotted to his side, surveying the yard, as if ensuring it was all as it should be. The day would bring new work, more rescues, more repairs, more bowls to fill. But for now, Harold let himself stand in the calm. The barn behind them glowed faintly through the frost on its windows, and the warmth inside seemed to seep out into the cold morning, a promise against the winter. As they turned back toward the door, Harold glanced at Brave and thought of all the lives yet to pass through their gates. Second chances weren't just something you gave once. They were a habit, a way of living. And as the shepherd stepped inside ahead of him, the fire's glow spilling across the floor, Harold knew this place, this shelter, this winter light would always hold the kind of welcome that left no one outside in the cold.